Tonight, I'm going to reflect with you about one of the, I think, most interesting characters in the war on either side. And that's saying a mouthful because this war has a number of interesting people on both sides. But General Philip Sheridan. Now, Phil was born in August. And he was the third of six children to two Irish immigrants. Now, there are some questions as to where he was actually born. Now, he claims he was born in Albany, New York, or close to Albany, New York. There's also some strong contention that he was actually born on a ship at sea while the family was immigrating over from County, I think, the Cavan, as he said, Caven, I believe, in Ireland. He was an Irish immigrant off the boat. There are other areas that he allegedly was born, but he says, and for my information, I will accept where the man said he was born in near Albany, New York. But shortly after his birth, the family moved to Somerset, Ohio. And Phil grew up in Somerset. And he was a pretty industrious fellow, pretty sharp, not a big fellow, very short. He actually grew to 5 feet 5 inches tall. And as I had said earlier, George McClellan, 5'6", and I'm 5'8", and it puzzles me that I am characterized as short when the average man was 5'6". I'm 2 inches taller than half the troops, well, half of the army on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. Phil was 5'5". Maybe a little taller than that when he wore the enormous cavalry boots that he liked to wear all the time. But he was industrious and he was pretty sharp. He became ultimately a storekeeper and a bookkeeper for a store there in Somerset, Ohio. And one of the customers was an Ohio congressman, and Phil pressed him to get an appointment to the military academy and got it. So Phil Sheridan entered the United States military academy in the summer of 1848. And he was said to have a bad attitude and not very good in math. Well, after 2 years, in 1850, he threatened a cadet on the parade ground over an assumed offense. It didn't take much for Phil to assume you offended him, bad temper, and he told his fellow cadet, William Trillin, he said, "Sir, I will run you through with a bayonet." And the next day, on the same drill field, Phil took umbrage at something else that his fellow cadet said, and Phil was all over him and got into a fight. And apparently, he must have hurt the fellow because he was suspended from the academy. He laid out a year and came back and graduated with the class of 1853 instead of his class of 1852. Phil, I suspect, is grateful that he was indeed even allowed to return to the academy. But he finished, and he was 32nd out of, I think, 51 that graduated in the class of 53. Then Phil is sent to Texas, the Indians, for a little while, a few months, and then he's sent out to Oregon, the Oregon Territory, and he was a lieutenant by the time. And for the next couple of years, he was in Rogue River Wars, another one of the Indian Wars, and it's also darkly said that he took up and was living with one of the Indian women up there whose English name was Frances, but nobody wants to talk about that. and I will not pursue it. But he gained combat experience in I think 3 different Indian wars up in the Oregon Territory. The Indians didn't see any problems except those that were caused by the white men moving into the area and causing problems for the Indians. But when the war started, Phil he was lieutenant right after Sumter was fired in April of 61. Phil was made a captain. So Captain Sheridan is then told to report to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. He did so. He goes around down the coast from San Francisco across the Isthmus of Panama, sailed up to New York. This trip I'd made a couple of times in 52 and 54. Goes to Somerset, Ohio, visited family. Remember, he had 5 brothers and sisters, and proceeded to go to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. Now, Phil's a pretty smart fellow. Henry Halleck, who was at that time commanding the Department of Missouri, or of Missouri, was in St. Louis's headquarters. Phil paid a courtesy call. Smart fellow. And Halleck was taken with him and said wanted Sheridan to conduct an audit of the Department of Missouri, because Halleck had just replaced John C. Fremont. And there was some questions, some money. In fact, $12 million in 61 about money. And Phil didn't want to do that. He wanted to get into combat. But again, he was smart enough to say, yes, sir, General, I'd be happy to do that. Remember, he'd been a bookkeeper back in Somerset, Ohio. And he very thorough investigation. And Halleck said, so, well, Captain, I'm going to keep you on my staff. Well, Phil swallowed real hard and said, okay. But then shortly thereafter, Halleck appointed him as a quartermaster to southwestern Missouri and around Arkansas and so forth. Phil talked him into making him the quartermaster of the district, and Halleck agreed. He goes down there and gets involved with General Samuel Curtis, and he fought in the Battle of Pea Ridge. Now, that's the first of a remarkable career that Philip Sheridan had, because he fought at Pea Ridge. Well, he is a quartermaster, remember, and he discovered, and I know this is hard to believe, and I hope the Army has changed now, but there were federal officers there on Samuel Curtis's who were stealing horses from local farmers, bringing them to the headquarters and demanding that Sheridan, the quartermaster, pay them for those horses. And Phil refused. He knew what was going on. And Samuel Curtis, General Curtis, told Captain Sheridan to pay those officers. And Captain Sheridan told General Curtis, no force on earth can, no, I'm not a jayhawker nor a thief, and no force on earth can make me become one. Well, as you can imagine, that did not sit well with General Curtis, who promptly had Sheridan arrested and put in the stockade and was going to court-martial him. However, he had friends, and when General Halleck got wind of that, Halleck talked to Samuel Curtis. Remember, Halleck is Curtis's commanding officer, and all of those charges went away, and Captain Sheridan was released. By this time, though, in a little while, Halleck takes Sheridan with him after Shiloh. So Sheridan was involved in that siege of Corinth. Now, at Corinth, Sheridan meets General Sherman. Sherman liked him so much that he said, I'm going to get you a commission from Ohio. That didn't pass. But somebody else steps in and got Sheridan a commission as colonel of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry. So now he's Colonel Sheridan. So he's gone from lieutenant right before the Sumter to captain right after Sumter. And that's in April 61. In April 62, he becomes Colonel Sherman and is commanding a cavalry regiment. And then this happens in May. In July the 1st, Sheridan is involved in a rather action at Boonville, Mississippi. And he fended off several charges from General James Chalmers, who was fighting Bedford Forrest. In fact, he was Bedford Forrest's favorite subordinate, called him Little Bit because he was a small man. Well, after the Battle of Boonville, so to speak, William Rosecrans is so taken with Sheridan that he writes a letter to General Halleck, and several other officers co-signed, and Rosecrans says about Phil Sheridan, good officers are hard to find and good brigadier generals are even more scarce. I urge you to appoint Colonel Sheridan as a brigadier general. He is worth his weight in gold. Well, that recommendation, the president saw fit, and Secretary of War Stanton, to appoint Sheridan brigadier general of volunteers. So now he's a brigadier general. Well, then when he becomes a brigadier general, he's transferred to Don Carlos Buell and the Army of the Ohio. Then he winds up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, on December the 31st of 62, the Battle of Stones River. He sensed a weak spot in Rosecrans' lines on the night of December 31st, and on the morning of January 1st of 63, when all those rebels came charging in mass to carry what they thought to be a weak spot, there's General Sheridan with his regiment, or several regiments. And they fired and fought until all their ammunition ran out. They had to fall back, but that gave Rosecrans enough time to pour into the gap and save the army at the Battle of Stone River. Well, for that, Sheridan becomes Major General Sheridan of volunteers. So let's see. April of 61, first he's a lieutenant, and then he's a captain. And in July, May he becomes colonel. July he becomes a brigadier general. Go around to January, and he becomes a general of volunteers. The man had fortune on his shoulders as well as those shoulder straps. So then he participated in the Tullahoma campaign when Rosecrans finally got moving, followed Bragg southwest across Tennessee. And when, as you know, Bragg kept falling back and in essence telling Rosecrans, come on, just a little further, come on, just a little bit further. Rosecrans thinks that Bragg is outnumbered. Bragg is reinforced. Even Robert E. Lee sends Longstreet's corps down there. Well, Bragg has actually more troops than Rosecrans, and on September the 19th at Chickamauga, Bragg let the hammer fall. And one of the most savage battles of the war is fought for the next 2 days. The second day of the battle, Rosecrans is overwhelmed because Bragg has pierced in the line. Longstreet goes into a gap in Federal lines, and they're beginning to split like a wedge Federal lines. Rosecrans, dare I say, panicked and fell back, and actually he skedaddled back into Chattanooga. George Thomas, holding Snodgrass Hill, and his troops are all armed with 7 repeaters. And that made the difference. And Thomas stood like the Rock of Chickamauga. That's where he got the nickname. And he held. Well, as Sheridan is skedaddling back to Chattanooga with Rosecrans, he gets information. Well, Thomas is back over here holding the line. So he said, we've got to get back and support them. So that he about faces and takes his troops back to support Thomas. Well, by the time they didn't have good maps, he didn't have the best. So by the time he gets back to support Thomas already held the line. Darkness is falling, and Longstreet falls back, and the battle is essentially over. So a lot of histories say that Sheridan got back in and actually supported George Thomas at Snodgrass Hill at Chickamauga. He did not. But what he did, first of all, he turned and he went back to fight. So he did not go into Chattanooga, but that also saved his reputation because Rosecrans fell from grace, as he should have, because he bolted and went back to Chattanooga. And as you will recall, when I became lieutenant general, I had the option to keep Rosecrans or relieve him of command and appoint George Thomas, which I did. So Sheridan becomes obliquely the hero of the day at Chickamauga because he went back to support George Thomas. Even though he didn't get back in the fight, at least he went. So he became promoted Major General, regular Army. So now he's a Major General. He's blown from lieutenant all the way through to Major General, regular Army in less than 2 years. So then he's leading a charmed life. He fights, and then I went to the Eastern Theater. I was not happy with David Hunter commanding in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, and General Hunter is an able commanding general. I cast no aspersions on General Hunter, but he wasn't doing what I wanted done. And I'm struggling with, before that though, I need to back up a bit. In the Overland campaign, I got Phil Sheridan with me because I'm looking for a cavalry leader in the Shenandoah. And I had to create the middle military district. You don't know much about that, but it's the middle military district. It was the Army became known as the Army of the Shenandoah. Well, George Meade wanted to be named that commander. I don't know how to take that. He's commanding the Army of the Potomac. I'm traveling. My headquarters is with the Army of the Potomac. I did not interfere with George's command unless I had to. And as the campaign wore on, that became increasingly more necessary. But in creating the middle military district to put an army in the Shenandoah Valley that would stop those reinforcements coming to Lee and stop that food source coming into Lee, I decided I'm going to create a military district. David Hunter was considered for it. George Meade was considered for it. B.F. Franklin was considered. William B. Franklin, actually one of my classmates from the academy, was considered for it. But for different reasons, I didn't want any of them. Halleck at a meeting, General Henry Wager Halleck at a meeting says rather subtly, he said, how about Sheridan? And said, that is a view of the question I have not taken. Why do you suggest Sheridan? And he said, and we're talking about commanding an Army cavalry. He's primarily an infantry commander. And General Alex said, I think astutely, he said, if he's a good commander of infantry, does it not stand to reason that he would be a good commander of cavalry? And I said, your point, General, is extremely well taken. Notify General Sheridan that he is going to become the commander of the Middle District, the Army of the Shenandoah. He joined me on April the 5th. That's, if you'll recall, 1 month before Lee hit me in the wilderness on May the 5th of 64. Sheridan was involved in that. He was involved in the wilderness, and then as we moved from the 2 days in the wilderness, I pulled away from Lee. The wilderness was a draw, and I was moving to Spotsylvania Courthouse and Tavern, just a few miles away. And Sheridan failed to, and it chagrined him greatly, but he failed to get his cavalry over to Todd's Tavern and Spotsylvania Courthouse in time to block the Confederate general who had replaced Longstreet, and I can't recall his name at the time, General Anderson, because Longstreet injured by his own men in the same place that Jackson was a year earlier, and the same wounds really that Jackson sustained by his own men. So Longstreet is in the hospital. Anderson is in Longstreet's brigade, and Anderson got to Spotsylvania Courthouse before Sheridan did. And we fought and brawled across Virginia for the next 3 weeks. But on May the 9th, Meade comes in and finds Sheridan's troops. Now, see, Sheridan was the first cavalry officer who wanted to use cavalry as cavalry should be used, as a combat arm, not to guard wagon trains and not to run messages back and forth, but to be a reconnaissance force and a combat arm. Well, Meade, who didn't like Sheridan either, catches Sheridan, and that's a negative way to put it, but what happened, I had Sheridan out in front of the wagon trains and supplies and in front of the Army of the Potomac being to find out where Lee was and to develop Lee's position, help me in deciding what to do. He was my eyes and ears. Meade catches Sheridan in the camp and says, well, he a lot of things I can't repeat, but he said, and in a not kind manner, why are you here? And Sheridan tried to tell him. Now, Meade's about 6'2", and Sheridan's 5'5", so Sheridan's looking up. Sheridan said, why are you challenging me on this? He said, you need to get back and guard those wagon trains. So Sheridan uttered and became outraged, and they got into a shouting match that soldiers letters home about, and they were giving each other a thorough cussing. Soldiers wrote letters home and diary entries about that, and they almost came to blows. So somehow they parted. Meade says, you get it back, get those troops back and guard wagon trains, and I mean right now. So Sheridan obeyed his order. I found out about that the next morning and was almost in tears over it, because I realized that throughout the night, that cavalry force screen that I thought was in front of me had not been in front of me. And I did not care for that information. But I found out when Meade came blasting into my tent like a load of double grape shot and giving me a good cussing until I stopped that. I knew he wasn't cussing me. He was cussing everything in the tent about Sheridan. And he said that Sheridan said, if you'll let me go, I'll kill or I'll whoop Jeb Stuart. And now I've got a problem. Meade is the commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac, and it's his army, and I want to keep it his army. Sheridan is a brilliant and hard-fighting cavalry commander, an innovative cavalry commander. He is serving me well, and I like him. I like them both. Now, what do I do? So I was whittling, and I said, did General Sheridan say that he'd whoop Jeb Stuart if he was cut loose? Me said, yeah, he did. Well, General Sheridan generally knows what he's talking about. Let him go. Give him orders to go after Jeb Stuart. Meade was greatly relieved because he got rid of somebody that was really a burr under his saddle. So he tells Sheridan to get and go after Jeb Stuart. Now, that hurt me, though. It was one of those decisions I made that I will admit was not a good one. I'm trying to keep two distinguished and hard-hitting men apart, and both of them do their job. It's like one of those circus riders that's riding two horses at the same time, and I've got to keep them both together, and it ain't easy to do. So I send Sheridan. Sheridan's gone from May the 9th to May the 24th. And in that period, I have to go to North Anna. I crossed the North Anna River, crossed it back. Lee could have annihilated us in detail. And I'm moving toward Cold Harbor. And it really, my orders to send Sheridan away crippled me, because at the time in that last year of the war that I most needed my eyes and ears, I had sent them away. And Sheridan took advantage of the orders. He went all the way to Richmond, which was, frankly, some showboating. And he was doing the same thing Jeb Stuart had been doing ever since the war started. The one successful part of that campaign was that on May the 11th, the day after he left the regular Army of the Potomac, he was at Yellow Tavern, and one of his troopers killed Jeb Stuart, who died mortally, wounded him. He died the next morning. So the best cavalry leader in that area, Bedford Forrest was the best cavalry leader that the South had, but he never had more than regimental command. But Jeb Stuart was the best that Lee had, and one of the best on either side. And Lee had lost Jeb Stuart. But in the other battles that were just running fights, Sheridan did not fare well. He lost a lot of troops. He finally came back and rejoined the Army on May 24th, and he fought the Battle of Hall's Shop, where he was pretty badly defeated, and some other activities. But he got to the crossroads at Old Cold Harbor before Lee got somebody there. And he was able to hold that position despite repeated assaults until I could get an infantry force there, and we were able to seize it. And that set it up for us to attack. The first assault on Cold Harbor was on June the 1st, with Sheridan there. The second, and the one that is most remembered, was on June the 3rd, when we lost 7,000 casualties in the day, not in 20 minutes as legend has it, but we took 7,000 casualties essentially in the first 2 hours. But we fought all day. It wasn't just a 20-minute engagement. By this time, I'm trying to stop what's going on in the Shenandoah Valley, and I want that middle military district. So I send Sheridan northeast into the Shenandoah, and I told him, burn it to the ground. It was the first time that we really initiated total war. And I told Sheridan to tell those folks in the Shenandoah Valley that as long as they have food and wherewithal to feed and supply an army, they may expect repeated attacks to destroy what they've got. We are not any longer going to provide a breadbasket or an armory for Robert E. Lee's Army of the Northern Virginia. So Sheridan took that to heart and was headed for the Shenandoah, but he didn't get there because now Wade Hampton is in command of the Confederate cavalry, and he intersected Sheridan at Trevelyan Station. and they fought 2 solid days. It was the largest cavalry, all cavalry engagement in the war. And the first day, Sheridan did all right. The second day, Wade Hampton whooped him badly. And so Sheridan comes back to the Army of the Potomac, uh, dragging his tail just a little bit, and he's with me again. Go into late summer and early fall, and once again, I sent Sheridan into the Shenandoah Valley. Jubal Early at this time, though, in August, is going into Washington City. He's trying to take the fight into Washington, and he raids northern Virginia, gets into Pennsylvania a little bit, causes some havoc. Sheridan went after him and whipped him at the Battle of Cedar Creek. Thought he'd whipped him completely, and he didn't, because Jubal Early got reinforcements. So in September, I think September the 19th, he's at, I think it was Cedar Creek actually. He attacks Sheridan's forces, and Sheridan is at Winchester, 10 miles away. He hears the cannonading, and he has an oh no moment, I expect. He jumped on Rienzi. Now, I need to tell you that Rienzi was a horse that he was given. Remember, I told you at Boonville, Mississippi on July the 1st of 62, he defeated Chalmers, James Chalmers, and became a brigadier general. Some of his troops found a horse, a beautiful, completely black horse, except for 3 fetlocks that were white. He was 16 hands high, and as the troops like to say, he was big and a really powerful horse. He rivaled Cincinnati in his size and beauty. And he actually, he's only remembered for Sheridan's ride from Winchester to Cedar Creek, but Rienzi was in 40 other engagements. In fact, he was wounded a number of times, and he lived until 1878. But the ride of Sheridan, Sheridan's ride, Thomas Reed, the poet and the painter, wrote Sheridan's Ride. It's like Paul Revere's Ride, that famous a poem, and Sheridan there in short order. Now, the other, Horatio Wright, General Horatio Wright, had already stopped the route. He'd already essentially stopped early, but Sheridan got the credit, and it was a magnificent ride. But Sheridan yet again gained some fame. And then he, after having realized that he thought he'd whooped Early and Early came at him, that's when he burnt 400 square miles of Virginia, burned it to the ground. It's known in that part of Virginia as the burn. And he burned it to the ground. And he proved the fact that he wanted it to be so barren. If a crow flew across it, he'd have to take his own rations with him. And I don't know if he actually said that or not, but it's a good story. And it applies to what Sheridan did. And then he came back and he joined me. When Lee fell back from Petersburg on April the 1st, again, Sheridan is there, Five Forks. And that's when I think Pickett in command was off at a shad bait some few miles away, and obliterated for all practical purposes Pickett's army there. And he also relieved Governor K. Warren of duty and charged him, I think, with cowardice in the face of the enemy, but he relieved him for duty. And that was later overturned several years later after General Warren had died. But I supported Sheridan in that decision to relieve Warren. I'd had problems with Warren too. But then on April the 6th, he caught his army at Sailor's Creek and for all practical purpose destroyed any of the Army of the Potomac. He caught 20% of the Army of Northern Virginia. He captured 7 Confederate generals, including Lee's own son, and Lee was all but destroyed. And then, as we pushed him into the Appomattox, Sheridan had ridden around south and then back northeast, and was between Lee on the north and Meade on the east. So Lee was caught between vice grip between the two armies. And I brought the surrender. That's another story. Sheridan was in the room for a while. My officers, I should like to say, they rotated in and out of the room. The parlor at the McLean House is only 20 feet by 16 and a half feet. So all those fanciful pictures that you see of the surrender, there were never that many men in that room at any time. No more than 3 or 4 of my officers at any time, and they were courteous enough to let other officers come in. But Sheridan was in for a while. I'd also like to point out Custer was not in the room. He was in the front yard where he belonged. And after the war was over, now there were 5 more surrenders after Lee surrendered. This Confederate surrender was in late September. But for the review in May 23rd, Sheridan was not there because I had ordered him down to Texas, where Maximilian was on the throne, puppet throne, for Napoleon III. And he was rumbling about coming back across the border out of Mexico into Texas. And I sent Sheridan down there because, remember, Sheridan is a proven savage fighter. He got down there with 50,000 troops. They got another 40,000 they gathered from the area. And Maximilian felt it prudent not to come across the Rio Grande River. And Emilio Juarez was also trying to overthrow. And Sheridan later said, after all was over and done, that he had actually stacked caches of arms and ammunition on the American side of the Rio Grande for Juarez to come across the river and get arms and ammunition. And they gave up. Napoleon III gave up, and so did Maximilian. Just a few months later, Juarez caught him, tried him, gave him a fair trial, then executed. And then the Mexicans have their government back. Sheridan was then named the military governor of, I think, the 5th military district, which was Louisiana and Texas. Well, he got sideways with President Johnson because there had been in late 66, there had been a riot in New Orleans where they overthrew the council and the provisional government was meeting. A lot of political activity, and 36 Negroes were killed that they know of, and the Southerners were seeking redemption and actually rumbled that had the White League, and they rumbled about, we're going to start the war again. Sheridan stopped that nonsense, and he removed the governor of New Orleans. He removed the Attorney General of New Orleans. He removed the judge down there. Anybody pretty much felt like was not cooperative, you're out. And then Governor Throckmorton in Texas, who was a former Confederate officer, Throckmorton says, I protest. You can't do this. And Sheridan said, yes, I can. You're removed from the governorship of Texas. And he put in the Republican rival that had defeated Throckmorton in the election just a little while earlier. And then when the Reconstruction government back in Louisiana tries to take their seats, what the White League was in the true government wouldn't let them in. Sheridan sends troops into the Louisiana State House, runs all of the first government, the bogus government, out at the point of the bayonet, and escorts in the new Republican government that has been legitimately elected. So at this time, even the New York Times screamed murder, gunmental murder in Louisiana, so forth. And Andrew Johnson, removed Sheridan from being the military governor. This outraged me, but he said he's a tyrant and nothing he's doing is support my administration. He's out. And so I pulled him back and sent him out to the West. Now, there at this time, there's the Department of the Missouri, which was everything from the Appalachian or the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, 1,000,000 square miles. The Indians are acting up again. They'd been quiet the first 2 years of the war, but in '63, John Chivington attacked some villages, killed everybody, every man, woman, and child in the village. Several of them dismembered their bodies, some real savagery. And then shortly after the Chivington massacre, which got the credit, the news, about 3,000, I think, Sioux and Kiowa and Oglala captured Chivington and his 1,100 men and butchered every one of them. And that is essentially a problem that we've got with the Indian war, because the Indians are retaliating from the savageries that are being committed on them. One has to take a look at that and say, can you blame them for what they're doing? Hey, you cut up and rape our women, murder our women, kill our children, hoist them on the top of your sabers, and then you're going to get upset because we do the same thing to you. And it was this going back and forth that was a real problem. And I was trying to get a handle, because I'm general of the Army. I've got the 4-star, and I'm in command of all armies, and I'm trying to stop these Indian wars. I sent Winfield Scott Hancock out there. Hancock goes out and attacks 2 villages and burns them to the ground, kills everybody in the village, including one of the chiefs holding up the treaty. He was holding up the treaty that they had, and somebody shoots him in the back and kills him. It was that kind of nonsense and barbarism that was going on that was fueling the Indian wars. Now we've got a real problem on our hands. So I replaced Hancock, sent Sheridan out there. And Sheridan pretty much stopped the wars, but he was not as barbaric as Hancock was, but he was still doing too much of that barbarism. He's even credited with saying the good Indian's a dead Indian. Now, he denies he ever said that. But what apparently really said, he talked to Chief Watauga Silverknife, Chief Silverknife. And Silverknife said, allegedly, me a good Indian in broken English. And Sheridan said, well, the only good Indian I've ever seen is a dead one. So that's what we had out there. Sheridan was able to bring the Indian wars pretty to an end, but that's got to be qualified, because we never really defeated the Indians. They just were worn out over the years until they were starving little clots of people, not in a tribe anymore, and we managed to get them on reservations. The onslaught of white settlers from the West was not going to stop, and gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Well, that was all for the Indians. And we needed to get the reservations. My feeling was, if we don't get them into protected areas, they're going to be exterminated. And the feeling ran high there about that. But to talk about what I tried to do is another time. Sheridan did what he could. I don't approve of everything he did, but he did what he could. After the war, when I became president, Sherman became General of the Army of the United States, and Sheridan became Lieutenant General. And then when Sherman retired in '83, Sheridan became the General of the Armies and got the 4 stars. And he died of a heart attack, liver failure and a heart attack, in August of '88 at the age of 57. And life was brought to an end. Just 2 months after he had sent his memoirs to the publisher to be published. So I think, as you can see, as one of the peripheral people in my life, Sheridan is really an interesting one. I would also like to say he was 5'5" and very slim most of his life, but by the time he died, he gained to 200 pounds. He was 5 feet 5 inches and weighed 200 pounds. And I think that probably contributed largely to his death. But I think with that observation, I have said quite enough. I'd like to open it up for any questions that anyone might have.